I want to put Roy and Billy in a really uncomfortable spot here by asking the question, and I don't know that you guys considered this because you probably assumed that I'd handle whatever the tenor of this was today. But how do you guys think this show should discuss the death of Hank Goldberg? Roy, don't laugh off mic. I need your help here. I need your. It is a terrible spot, but if you're going to laugh, what do you mean why?
Why are you asking Roy?
Well, I'll tell you what. All right, I'll come back to them. I'll give them a minute to think. But thank you for bringing the stuff your direction, because you yesterday.
What happened?
Your Twitter platitudes.
Huh?
Hank Goldberg died hating you.
Well, thank you.
That's how we should talk about it, by the way.
With his last breath, he died hating you from Las Vegas, as you knew he would, Stugotz. And you're out here saying legend because you don't have anything else to say, which is a lot. A lot of people were out here saying legend yesterday because they just didn't know what else to say.
Hank Goldberg, whether we had a good relationship or not, and I'm with you, he died hating me. But
and me, I think.
Oh, he hated you. Listen, Hank Goldberg spent I want to say the final 2 or 3 years of his local radio show doing nothing but attacking you. And he was at his best.
It wasn't the last 2 or 3 years, Stugotz. It was 10 years.
Okay.
It wasn't 2 or 3 years.
I was trying to be nice. I didn't want you to feel that bad. But you're right. It was the last decade of his show, and he was attacking you and ripping your column. But I may have not had the best relationship with Hank towards the end. In fact, I had no relationship with Hank. And you're right. He hated me. But Hank was a legend. That's all I was saying. Like, Hank was a legend, and he deserves to be called a legend, because he is a South Florida icon. He's a legend.
More than that, more than merely a legend, I can say this honestly. If not for Hank Goldberg, this would not exist. All of it. The Hank Goldberg coaching tree, the best thing it birthed, sits right next to me. It has belched out little other radio talent, but Stugotz is the lasting legacy of what Hank Goldberg did, and I believe you're calling him a legend and an icon because you want to be one too. Because this is like the way Romeo Crennel talks about Belichick.
Well, Stugotz is a legend in this industry, absolutely. But wasn't Hank Goldberg part of the pitch to get Dan to radio? Because Hank spent years ripping Dan on the air. And part of how you sweeten the pot was you have a microphone, you have your own platform, and you can go at Hank Goldberg. I know that was part of Dan's motivation, too.
I think Hank viewed Dan as a threat. Hank, at his core, was a credible journalist, a reporter, and that gave him a ton of credibility. Now, it just so happens that Hank was also an amazing storyteller, had a weird, different kind of sense of humor. But yes, because he talked about Dan so much when I was the executive producer of his show, I figured, hey, I got to hire this guy to go against Hank Goldberg. Because Dan didn't have, what Dan had was print. He didn't have a microphone to respond to what it is Hank was saying on a daily basis. And Hank was saying a lot about him. And I'm like, if I could get Hank to go against Dan, or Dan to go against Hank, then Dan would have a daily platform in which he could fight back. He could snap back if indeed he wanted to.
Mike, why are you laughing? Are you laughing because what Hank Goldberg's coaching tree has birthed is a radio voice that is just, even though it's early in the week, under attack and caught in a knot of phlegm and can't even get out the eulogy because he's so unhealthy?
You sound like your tongue weighs 17 pounds.
I mean, listen.
Jesus Christ.
It was a long weekend. I got to be honest with you.
Thank you, Hank. Indeed a long weekend.
Thank you, Hank.
I lost Hank.
Hank.
Oh, I'm sorry for your loss.
Yep, the hammer. I mean,
Roy, Billy,
big part of my life.
Coming back to you guys, I say this genuinely because I'd like to take the high road on this.
We're a little late on that. Yeah, still late. And I'm all for
you
it.
would like to take the high road.
I don't want to get aggregated. I don't want to get aggregated as Le Batard dances on Hank Goldberg's grave or buries Hank Goldberg. I will
that
not.
Took care of itself.
I am not, and would not. I would never say that I am happy to see anyone die.
No one suggested that.
You're bringing that up on your own.
Yeah.
Are you?
You're cha-cha sliding on his grave right now.
Your voice sounds great.
No. I'm just saying that I was never that happy when he was alive.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
So not like this is how I would say we should do the Hank
He
thing.
he was truly terrible to so many people. And when I ask you guys, how should we discuss this? I'm asking you, should we discuss this honestly, or we're going to make Richard Nixon's eulogy about opening free trade to China? Like, you want to talk about this honestly? He was a legend, yeah. And he was an asshole to a whole lot of people.
Perfect.
Yeah. You're getting aggregated. Feels wrong.
Not nice. Yeah.
Feels wrong.
Yep.
He absolutely was
Dancing
a legend.
on a grave. I mean,
he was the sports voice down here, and he was crowned by ESPN when they didn't really talk about gambling. They talked about it in the shadows, and he was kind of allowed. He was radio. It's hard to describe who he was. Radio. He was a total dick, but he was a dick on the air. It's not like we're talking shit about, well, we kind of are, but his persona was, I'm an insufferable dick. I mean to everybody. Like, I will yell at people on the air. This was part of his persona. And, he, like the greatest characters, it was pretty close within his own personality.
he was mean to everyone. He respected a few people. Ed Kaplan was one of them, and I think that's the only one. Ken Malden, his update anchor, he was very respectful of Kenny. He was respectful of older people. He did not like you for whatever reason, but he didn't like you because Hank had an ego and you were a perceived threat. That's why he didn't like you, and you were very good at your job. But you know,
I want to.
He didn't like people who were good at their jobs.
It's a funny thing to say, but I won't actually tell like the stories that would be unflattering to him in the way that he tried to play defense on my career. I won't tell those stories, and I don't want it to seem like there was any joy in what happened yesterday, because Hank Goldberg in this town did create a sports voice that helped make us national and made gambling a little more normal. And Hank Goldberg in this town, before anybody else, was a big shot in this town as a journalist locally and nationally, you know, knighted by the people like Larry King, who were also noticing that in Miami there was a special kind of radio going on with Neil Rogers and no rules, and they helped make sports a little bit bigger in Miami, at least in part because Hank Goldberg had a relationship with Don Shula and had credibility among the Dolphins.
Here's how I'll remember Hank Goldberg. Specific to us, I'd argue that there was no person more essential to the growth and development of our show, both in its formation and also it gave us something to chase. It was the carrot at the end of the road. Like we were taking beatings at the hands of that guy when it was an old diary system in the books because he was just this legacy. He allowed us to be counterculture because he established the South Florida radio culture. And he was also a miserable prick.
When Stugotz says legend and icon, and when Mike says helped imprint this show, it is indisputable that this only exists because of how awful those people were to me and my newspaper at WQAM. We have some sound there, just a little bit of Neil Rogers and Hank just so that you know what informs what happened here, because this was birthed in reaction to 10 years of my columns being stolen by Stugotz, taken into Hank to enrage him, and then Stugotz and Hank would do 3 months of shows over the summer.
It was our show sheet.
They weren't stolen. Yeah. You put it out in public. You just go buy a newspaper.
Actually, Hank just walked in with a paper in his hand at the time, right? I didn't steal anything. Hank just walked in, he opened up the newspaper, he read Dan's column, and he commented. That was it.
Yeah, Woody Page stole from you, not Hank.
Yes.
And so which sound do you have here, Mike? Because the archive on Neil Rogers, just so that you know what we were up against in the early 2000s as Stugotz built a station to challenge the incumbent, the hardest thing. I want you to notice, and the part that Mike is so right about, I learned what not to do from him. Like when instead of being threatened by Izzy or Sedano or you or anybody else,
he was just threatened by you, man. I'm telling you, that's it.
No, but and what ended up happening is
there are stories out there.
Listen to how that sounded, whatever it is, 20 years ago.
Yeah, we have sound here because dancing on one grave wasn't enough. We also reintroduced Neil Rogers to the program. This sounds from Neil Rogers' show, and it's Hank and Neil, and this is old-time radio, reliant on the diary system where people would say that they listened to you for 12 hours a day when they barely listened to you at all, and it was all about a numbers game, numbers. When the science started changing a little bit, their numbers fell off a cliff, and you could make the argument it actually killed Neil Rogers because his identity was so tied up in ratings dominance, and it was a house of cards. And Hank, by the time this came about, he was at the end of his road, professionally speaking. He was starting to deteriorate on the air. He was losing audience, and there was a lot of insecurity. But boy, did they love those ratings books when they were winning.
When all's said and done, Neil, I make Mandich 5-1 over him in the ratings.
5-1?
Yeah.
Give me a break.
Jim will have a 5, at least a 5.5 to a 6 share, and he will have a 1.2.
No, 1. They're never going to. Dan Le Batard's going to have a 1 in his dreams, man. About a 0.8. Take it to the bank.
Mandich is going to be missed. If I'm the Dolphins, that's the one concern I have, that they lose Mandich from those broadcasts. And you know something? Jim won't complain, and he'll just go on and continue to kick Le Batard's ass every day.
I mean,
the guy has no talent. He has no class.
Right.
And he has.
Don't forget when the Marlins won the series in '97, he said the Marlins didn't win the World Series. We won the series, the Cubans. It was Levon. Remember that? That was one of the most embarrassing episodes in history.
I'll never forget when they got Leiter and Kevin Brown the first time around. And he wrote about what a waste of money that was, how they were overpaid.
Oh, he's got his thumb right on it.
And he had his thumb right on Ricky Williams, too.
Yeah.
In fact, he had his thumb all over Ricky Williams.
The sharper guy they got over there is either him or Greg Kotex at that fish wrapper.
That's a dead heat, too.
Yeah. I don't know how we can contend with Stugotz, man.
You know what? Look up nitwit in the dictionary, and you'll find it there.
There's this picture right next to it. I'll be danged.
Yeah.
It's great radio. I mean, gotta hand it to him.
Called you a nitwit.
Greg,
so?
Look up nitwit in the dictionary. It's one of the oldest insults I've ever heard. That audio isn't that old.
It's an honor. I mean,
that's from 2005. It sounds like it's from 1955.
Greg Cody took us stray there.
Kotex.
They got me on Al Leiter and Kevin Brown.
I was going to say, you made a good point. I have new information. Team Hank.
This is going to be what's going to end up happening here, okay? And you guys, this has happened before. John Saunders died when we were on air, and we had an incredibly awkward moment afterward with Billy Ray Cyrus. I'm not going to tell you how to grieve. You're not going to tell me how to grieve. And we're going to end up getting aggregated somehow because people will not have the context of this hour, and 2 or 3 things will get put into the
There's no
stream.
missing context here. You guys have been taking a victory lap over his death.
Billy, this is what I'm saying to you. Okay, then allow me to correct that if that's the way that this comes off, because I am in no way happy about, obviously, like, get out of here, man. I don't wish death upon anybody, and that guy did a lot of stuff in our career that got in the way of everything that's been here since. Actively, your job. Like, did stuff to get in the way because whatever he felt threatened by there. And I'm speaking honestly of the dead. I don't mean to speak ill of the dead. I do respect the man. I did respect the man. I don't respect what it is that he did to us or tried to do to us. And Stugotz knows it because he was right next to him.
I will say this about Hank, Dan. He did have some bad qualities. He also, once you got to know him, once you did good by Hank, and that took me a couple of years to kind of crack, but once I got there, he was immensely loyal. He was always checking in on me, checking in on my family, and so there were some good qualities to Hank Goldberg, but there were also some bad qualities, a lot of bad qualities to Hank. He wasn't terribly nice to a lot of people, and that in part really kind of shaped his show, the ratings he got from the show. He was respectful of people that he felt like he needed to be respectful of. Chris Mortensen, Al Davis, John Saunders, since you mentioned him, people at ESPN. But when there was a perceived local threat out there, no, he did not react well to it. And you were a perceived local threat. You were young, you were up and coming, you were connected, you were opinionated, you were smarter than he was. He knew it, and therefore he took a lot of it, especially on air. He took it out on you. I think Hank was proud of me. I think he was happy for me. I think he enjoyed my success. What happened was I had that success with you, and that drove him crazy. For whatever reason, it drove him crazy.
Why did he hate you at the end?
Because of you.
Yeah, because you guys teamed up, and he always
Yes.
hated you. It's not earth-shattering to reveal to the audience, and I don't. Well, you can certainly argue, and I think Billy's been right to place a governor here, and that there's a time and place. It was so caked into the fabric of who his personality was, at least locally. Nationally, if I just remember Hank Goldberg from his ESPN hits and the Schwam talking about him, this would come off very jarring. But I think anyone who knows the history of our show and the history of South Florida's media market knows that Hank was notoriously a jerk. He was a jerk on air. He was a jerk to his callers. It's why his fans kind of liked him. The legacy listeners that he had knew exactly who he was. We're not breaking any news to them, and they loved Hank for it.
I can tell you that Hank was at his best when he was ranting, when he was going after callers, when he was going after Dan. That's when he was at his best. So I don't know why that was the reason, but like there's a legendary call that stands out to me where some guy called in, disagreed with him about the stadium. He loved stadium talk. Oh, did he love stadium talk? Top 5 topic for Hank. But he told that caller to crash into a telephone pole, then tell him where he was, because he wanted to stand over the caller. So the last thing the caller saw before he died were Hank's testicles hanging in his face. I mean, just great radio.
Get your top 5 list of Hank Goldberg topics so that we could give people the actual eulogy and the homage that the man deserves as an icon in our community.
He said, Len, go crash your car into a telephone pole and then tell me where you've crashed so I can come stand over you so the last thing you see are my testicles hanging in your face.
And one of his signature moves was
Lenny from Sunrise.
When callers were dumb, he would lop their balls off in a way that you would hear a cleaver lop off the bobbit balls of somebody.
I remember where it was that we found the news that we had finally beaten Hank in the ratings for the first time. We were doing a remote from a quarterdeck, and the news came across that we had finally overtaken Hank in the ratings, and that was a major achievement. It was a huge mile marker for us. Yeah. And then we grew after that. There was that initial thing where you battle back and forth a little bit. I think he won the very next book, but then we finally regained the lead and started really wrestling the market away from him. He was a Titan down here. He was the voice of South Florida. It's why he got the ESPN recognition. When you talked, there wasn't a lot of local sports talk. He was the guy. That was it. He had the industry to himself.
He was the guy. In fact, Sports Illustrated did a story about, when sports radio was really growing and getting big. They did a story about the 15 biggest local sports radio shows in America, and Hank was one of the featured shows. He was really good at his job. You may not have liked him. You certainly had every reason to not like him. But I think what drove Hank crazy was he knew that I knew how much he disliked you. And for me to team up with you and then beat him in the ratings, that didn't sit well with Hank. He didn't like that. Like, he was upset with me. Now, he told me the last time I saw him, you did a very nice tribute for Edwin Pope at Marlin Stadium. And Hank whispered in my ear, I'm proud of you. You stuck with the name. You've done a great job, and I'm proud of you. And that's the last time we spoke. So maybe he hated me, but the last time I had an actual conversation with Hank, I got what I wanted out of Hank. Hey, I'm proud of you. I just don't like who you had the success with, but I am proud of you.
Well, I didn't actually know that until now, though. I didn't know the backstory until this moment. No, but I didn't know the backstory, any of it, with you. I did not know why Hank hated you. I assume he hated you just because you were a climber. that you were Stugotz, that you were the guy, the once-in-a-lifetime story, a one-in-one story in the business, goes from producer to getting investors to I'm going to make myself a self-made man. I'm Stugotz. I'm everything this nickname was bestowed by this man represents. I am the proud birthing, the love sports child.
Don't understate your own ability to be unlikable.
Well, thank you. I'm not, but I think if I did a show with Craig Minervini, A, I'd probably be out of the business. B, I likely never beat Hank Goldberg in the ratings. And C,
what did Craig do?
Well, nothing. But Hank liked Craig. He wasn't a threat. Yes.
Took another stray, like Cody took a stray.
That's not a shot at Minervini. I chose
not complimentary in any way.
No. You're misunderstanding.
The show wouldn't have worked because Minnie in the Midday was a show and it didn't end up working.
Minnie wasn't a threat to Hank. Dan was the ultimate threat to Hank. And for me to leave Hank and immediately team up with Dan did not sit well with Hank. That's all. Now, Hank forgets there was a little year in between where I did a show with Carl Foster.
Yeah. You also did a show with Toast.
The Foss.
I honestly am learning right now. Okay, I really did think. I really honestly.
Well, you went to 940 before you started 790 because you did a show with Toast.
Weren't you on 1700 The Fan?
No, it was on 940. I left Hank and started.
Was on 1700.
Correct. I left Hank, started doing a show with Toast, which eventually turned into a morning show with Carl Foster and Anita Marks and the Racing Nuts.
Yeah. The bullpen.
And the Racing Nuts.
Yeah.
The racing
NASCAR guys.
The Racing Nuts. Yeah. Wait a minute. Wait,
you did a NASCAR morning show?
I did too. They were part of the show, Billy. I mean,
what was the name of the show?
I had no choice. I was desperate.
Who did you sell? What did you sell to these people? What was this show? Tell me more about this show. Tell me more about the Racing Nuts show, please.
I can't remember their names. Steve something, the Racing Nuts, 940. They would come on for like 20 minutes a day. They would give us a racing recap, a racing update. I left that show when Anita Marks decided to do Botox on the air. It's my final day.
What, like as a shock shot?
We needed money.
Yeah, that was the line for you.
That was you had
a line.
You took a moral stand.
No, there's no way.
Advertising
that's how that
integration.
Happened. No, please call Anita Marks. There's no way that Stugotz took a principled radio stand at that point in his career.
I think I did. Yeah.
That you drew the line.
I left the show that day. I know that.
You drew the line at Botox on air. I will not do that for ratings. I will not do that.
Did you leave for 940 or what happened? How did you get latched on to 940? Did you quit 560 or did they quit you?
No, I left 560. I started working at First Miami Securities because you need a backup plan. And my backup plan was always, finance. It was money. It's always the backup plan. And so I simultaneously had this morning show and was working at First Miami Securities. So I would go and do the morning show. I'd do it till 10 a.m., and then I would leave and go to First Miami Securities and sell munis. Murray! And
it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story, and it needs to be embraced because he is a radio Hall of Famer, and
thank you.
And Hank should be proud that this is what he birthed because he also birthed a legend.
But how did the 940 thing happen? Because I remember listening to you and Toast.
So I was desperate. I wasn't getting the airtime I wanted at QAM. And so I did a show with Toast at 940 Wins. And it was really like I viewed it as my final opportunity to try to create a show. Like if this didn't work out, I was going to go just do finance for the remainder of my life.
It wasn't a bad show for what it's worth. I enjoyed listening to it.
But a bigger show came along and it was brokered, and that was Carl Foster. And he was doing morning 6 to 10, and he asked me to be a part of that show, along with Anita Marks and the Racing Nuts.
Well,
they weren't rating nuts.
No, certainly not.
They worked against us in that way.
Well, I want to know something here because everyone.
They're good guys, though.
It was funny, Stugotz. I don't know what was being triggered here, but Billy, Roy, Whittingham, and Mike Ryan looking into the room. There was something about hearing Racing Nuts for the first time. Three of you dropped your heads into your laps, and Mike immediately began soothing himself by rubbing his arms. Whatever was happening in that room, you were all feeling the same thing. So
there's something missing in this story, because he went and it was his last shot at 9:40, and then he went to the morning show. But in his last shot, he took the principled stance of leaving a show because of Botox on air for some reason.
And then started another radio station.
Just something's missing
when
here.
It's a brokered show. The whole thing is just advertising, but he took exception to the advertising within the advertising.
I did. What happened there, Billy, was so I spent the year that I was working with Carl trying to figure out, hey, can I put together another radio station? Because I thought 940, which had a great signal, and I was thinking to myself, this could be the place.
So you thought bigger. You're like, instead of a brokered show, an entire brokered radio station.
Correct. And so I started, putting the pieces together. And so I spent a year not really listening to Carl Foster, and certainly not listening to the Racing Nuts, but developing a business plan and a business model that would hopefully create a radio station where I could hire Dan to go against Hank.
In crayon.
Yes.
So you were plotting.
Yes, I was plotting.
You spent a year plotting against Hank.
But I had the plot from the inside.
Yeah.
Yes. That's what I needed
the belly
to do.
Of the beast.
Yes.
It was
a long game.
It was a one-pronged plan. Find rich sugar daddy.
Exactly right. And I found him.
Number 2, bankrupt said rich sugar daddy.
Well, listen, perhaps I did that. Perhaps he did that to himself. The Versace mansion was not our best decision. Neither were the Dolphins. We paid a lot for the Dolphins. I'm not going to lie, too much.
You brokered that deal, right?
I brokered that deal. In fairness to me, I told him not to do it. I did. I'm like, hey, it'd be nice to have the Dolphins, but don't do it.
But the Dolphins were negotiating with you. The radio negotiations on the Dolphins that helped bankrupt this person who helped you climb from your principal stand around Botox.
Yes. Their negotiations started with me, and they quickly learned that, although inexperienced, I was somewhat responsible, especially since it wasn't my money. And so they quickly learned that, hey, we need to shuffle
opposite things.
We need to shuffle away from Stugotz and just go straight to the source, to the money guy. And they got to the money guy, and we know the money guy. He wasn't saying no to anything. And so I remember telling him, like, hey, I'd love to have this. This feels very expensive because it was expensive. The Dolphins are taking advantage of you. But he wanted the Dolphins in the worst way. He wanted Joe Rose. He wanted to try to get Jim Mandich. He got Joe Rose. He made Joe Rose, a Dolphin announcer. But, man, I wish we hadn't done that.
In the radio wars, for the history, because this is inside on the people who've been listening to our show for 20 years. But if you want to understand, okay, because some of this stuff is, I'm going to regret how some of this stuff looks in print, because I will say again, Hank Goldberg was critical in shaping how it is we do everything that we're doing around here. And he did have 2 personas. He had the on-air character who would castrate people and call them jack-offs and be the mean guy and get ratings that way. And the more insecure him around the paddocks came to ESPN and was made nationally relevant through whatever it is the insecurities are that fat guys like us have in sports, that we were never as great as the athletes. And he was a lot of boisterous bluster, but in deep down, it took adulthood for me to realize it. I didn't realize it when I was in my 20s. I was scared. I was just trying to carve a space for myself in the market. And there was a legend here standing in my way. And I meant him no ill, but every day on the radio, him and Neil Rogers, while forming radio in this market, get this sound, because somebody sent it, Billy Corbin sent it to me last night, this Neil Rogers sound, so that you know what shaped my viewpoints on stuff over the last 20 years. When I'm coming up through Miami in my 20s, and I'm trying to, be what Hank Goldberg is, because that seems like it'd be a cool thing to be. That seems like it'd be fun to be. The guys who dominated this market and were great at radio, and the rules were different in South Florida. They could say whatever they wanted. Whatever they wanted. Neil Rogers, there were no rules. He was the most controversial. He got ratings because he was the best. He did a show by himself, and it was wildly entertaining. But these guys, this is what I met coming up. So how bad is this, Billy?
This eulogy?
Yes.
It's not how I would want to go. I'd be dead too. To Tony's points, I wouldn't hear it. Yeah.
Is it how Hank would have wanted to go?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, like
Hank would want you eulogizing him.
Well,
I think he would have saying some nice things about Hank. Like, he was a loyal guy. He was a talented host.
Well,
he was a great storyteller, unique sense of humor. He's one of the greatest hosts ever.
Would he have been fine with all the bad things that we're saying about
He doesn't
him,
give a shit what you think about him.
Yeah.
He does not care. He fundamentally did not care how Dan felt about him. He didn't. He didn't care. He didn't care how I felt about him. He didn't care about how anyone felt about him.
Not surprised if you listen to Hank.
The only person that Hank cared about in terms of how they felt about him was Tom Curtis. That is it. TC, Michigan. I mean, that's the only guy he cared about.
Dolphin
cared about Bino Cook.
Bino. That's about it. He didn't care. Billy, this was a human being who did not care if you liked him, you hated him. He was going to march to his own drum. He was going to do his own thing. He was going to do his show, go to the track, go to the strip club, have a tongue sandwich, go home, wake up, do it again. Didn't care if Dan liked him or respected him. Did not care.
I could have sworn he almost died live on air at the Raw Bar at Club Madonna.
No, that's one of his last broadcasts.
Yes.
I think it might have been his last South Florida broadcast. And I think the funny side of him would have thought that's
Perfect
a good
way
way
to
to go in front of Club Madonna on South Beach, doing a remote, having slurring on air because you're losing your faculties, and I think that might have been his last broadcast.
I'll also say this, that if you told me when I was producing his show, I had a conversation with Josh Darrow, who was the program director at the time. Yesterday, we had this conversation. Josh Darrow was the program director, who happened to also be Hank's executive producer before I was the executive producer for Hank's show. If you told Hank back in the 80s, 90s that he would make it until he's 82, Hank would have laughed you out of the room. He would have said there's no way. He lived an unhealthy lifestyle. He didn't eat well. He didn't exercise. We used to talk to him about it. Like, I think Hank would be fine with all of this because Hank didn't give a shit. He did not care. If you liked him, you liked him. If you didn't, you didn't. He didn't care either way. And so what we're saying, I feel like, is respectful. There are great qualities to Hank, great qualities. But there are also bad qualities to Hank. I lived them. I had a front row seat to see them. So I know they exist, but I also know the great ones exist as well. The loyalty, all of it.
I saw less of that. And I didn't have a relationship that had much substance. And the way you're describing this makes me sound like the petty one, the insecure one. And because he doesn't care what people think. And clearly, it sounds like I do. Because everything we formed around here, Stugotz, I'm telling you, the only reason I was receptive to doing this as a career choice is because I was tired of how they were hammering my newspaper every day.
Yes.
How the people who had the powers, it wasn't just me, it was the newspaper in this market, and the newspaper didn't have an outlet. And so I just wanted a place where I could be heard, and I wanted to compete against him every bit as much as you wanted to put us on competing against each other.
I'm not going to mince my words. He attacked the Herald almost on a daily basis, and I'm not going to mince my words when I say this. He fundamentally did not like Dan. For whatever reason, which I always found strange because he barely knew Dan. But he would read that column, and I'm sorry if that makes you feel bad, but I think you know this, right? Like, he never met Dan. He didn't know Dan. He didn't spend a lot of time with Dan. Had he, perhaps they would have liked each other and found some mutual respect. But Hank didn't take the time to do that. Hank was threatened by Dan. I don't know any other way to say that. He had ego. And the only guy that kind of challenged Hank in this market in terms of popularity, in terms of opinions, connections, all that, was Dan. And Hank didn't take to that very well. And so he went after Dan almost on a daily basis.
And it's almost the most human of things, okay? Having come through this market and seen what this profession can be at its ugliest, look, man, a guy dominated this market, and I understand he wanted to keep his power. I get it. And I wasn't actually challenging him and I wasn't trying to beat him or be poisonous. I was just trying to be left to do my career without also doing his job because every show was just a bashing of our newspaper.
But I could sit here and tell you as someone who produced his show who also did not know Dan but knew Hank very, very well. I didn't meet Dan until Dan and I spoke about the radio station. It's the first time I met Dan. So Hank is doing this show for years. He's attacking Le Batard. And I was thinking to myself, hey, if I'm Dan Le Batard, I wouldn't like this man. Like you guys had never met.
I didn't know him.
But I remember actively thinking to myself, hey, if I'm Dan, I wouldn't like this guy. This guy is attacking me, my column, and my newspaper on a daily basis in a way that was mean.
I take no pleasure from his death. I take no pleasure from his unhappiness, or like I don't. I really don't. I did not mean to take anything from him until he made it into a fight that felt a little bit personal. And you're hearing some of that today because I do wonder in these moments of eulogy, is it just going to be the Jeremy Schaap piece, which is nice and touching, but calls him
he did a good job.
Calls him humble. Calls him humble.
Now, Hank and Dick Schaap had a great relationship. They did. They had a fantastic relationship. Like, he respected Dick Schaap in a way that he did not with Dan, for whatever reason.
He didn't respect anybody coming for his stuff. QAM kind of fomented this culture. I remember listening to George Sedano, who was maybe 20 years old at the time, on 1700. It was a crap signal. And I was just so hungry to hear somebody else because I love sports. I listen to Hank, but God, did I want a choice in the matter. Anytime any of these new startup stations started, whether it be 940 or 1700 and then eventually 790, I was dying for those shows to be good. I listened to all of them because I all thought comparatively they spoke to me and my sensibilities. George Sedano was a young Cuban man talking sports, and it was so great to hear. And then Hank would just totally dismiss him on the air. He would totally dismiss Dan. A lot of these things, there was something in common. Yeah, they were young. Yeah, they were the new generation. They were taking their stuff, but they were also Latino, and that always kind of bothered me even before I knew what was actually going on.
It just informs so much of our imprinting is my point. And I know that part of this will be splashy because it feels disrespectful, and I understand that. But if you're looking for the history of this show, like its birthplace, when Mike is young and trying to figure out if he wants to live in sports, if he wants to work in sports, and is dying for an alternative. Give me something that's just not that. It informs everything if you've been listening for 20 years, including how I've been shaped on viewing race relations. Because it hurt when I'm listening to the radio and the two guys who are in charge in this market are saying stuff that's like, how am I supposed to fight this?
This is a sound from Neil Rogers, and it probably highlights what we're getting at.
Wait till I get to this Dan Le Batard. Can I make a suggestion? How about if we just take Dan Le Batard and put him on a banana boat and just send him back to Cuba? I know Fidel wouldn't want to take him, but let's give him no opportunity, no choice. He's yours. You are, Dan, and this covers a lot of territory, so this is quite an honor that I'm giving you now. You are the biggest asshole who has ever descended upon this town. There isn't anybody. I can't think. I mean, this guy makes Barry Jackass look like Red Smith in terms of sports writing, in terms of a human being, in terms of a mentality. Today he's got a thing about the gangster jocks, about pros and cons, all that stuff we talked about months ago. Never met a gangster he didn't like. In fact, I'm so inspired by Dan Le Batard, I think I'm going to call up Paul Tagliabue and suggest that the NFL should start gangster tryouts at every prison, every penitentiary all over America from coast to coast. God only knows how many good criminals we'll come up with. Huh? Yeah, the gangster teams. This guy never met a gangster. And then, of course, interesting enough, in his same newspaper today is the latest story about Irving Spikes. Oh! But Dan Le Batard, don't confuse him with the facts. We're going to send you back, Danny. We're going to put a medianoche under each armpit. We're going to stuff a picture of Levon right up your rectum and send you back where you came from and hope they'll take you. In fact, let's just ship him over to Guantanamo. Maybe they'll think he's Yugoslavian.
Great use of rectum.
Rectum.
I mean, genius.
The rectum really makes it. It's why he was a radio legend.
The visual of two medianoches under each arm totally as a floaty.
It would totally go. If they sent me away, I would put a medianoche under each arm so they'd be nice and warm. It's totally fair criticism.
It was a different time back then, wasn't it? You said asshole. You can't say asshole. You've never been allowed to say asshole on the radio.
He
could say whatever he wanted.
There were no rules in this market. They did that for a decade.
They did.
And so I just ask you on the day. I ask you honestly. I ask you feeling absurd because I did not mean to disrespect the man, and I probably did. And I obviously did.
Our intentions were pretty clear.
Okay.
We wanted to get the other side out, and we felt like today was the day to do it, which is kind of messed up.
It's not right. It's wrong.
But this is when you're listening.
Should I apologize now before
Apologize
it gets out?
for what?
Did Hank ever apologize to you?
No, I tried. I only met him like once or twice.
Well, he came to Pope Fest and lost in that Club Madonna story was you actually handed the show off to him. He was following you on 790. It had come that full circle that in his last desperate attempt to still maintain relevancy in the market, to still do radio, because I think he honestly had a passion for it. He was doing the show after hours.
Did Stugotz hire him for that? Like, who put Hank in the position for his last show?
I think we were swiped by then.
I think, well, I remember Hank came with a few sponsors, and so that made it...
Yeah, brokered programming.
It made it worth
Real full circle.
It made it worth trying, especially at night. Like, bring the hammer back, have him do a gambling show.
It was cool. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I remember my most vivid memories. I listened to that show. I listened to Hank, and I thought Hank was dying on the air. But I remember the ratings show because their identity was so tied up in ratings dominance. And we just knew in doing it. We knew that we were catching on. We knew that we had built up a very loyal, vocal, younger audience. We just knew it.
He knew it too, by the way.
That the ratings books were lying. We knew what we were doing and that it was working. And I remember listening to the shows every ratings Wednesday, I think it was, on Neil, when we started phasing into like the beeper system out of the diaries and you were getting true data. You could hear everything that they believed in evaporate. Like, Neil was a shell of himself. Like, that guy with the bravado sending you back to Cuba with media noches under your armpits, that wasn't who he was by the end. He stopped showing up to work because he couldn't face it. That he just flatly wasn't that guy. That his life for the last few years was a lie. That whole station had a very difficult reckoning with it. And I'd be lying if I didn't tell you I enjoyed that. Like, I enjoyed the hell out of it. I enjoyed being the guys that did that to them and taking that away because of how they treated guys like Sedano, because of how they always called you Dan Le Batard, because how they kind of treated any Latin voice up here that was trying to cover it.
No, Izzy too.
Yeah, I think he's like, what's that, Israel Gonzalez, and he was correcting, and he's like, same thing. There were, I mean, there was a lot of stuff that felt racist. I mean, that clip was racist on several different levels. He took out several races there. That was Neil. That wasn't Hank, by the way. I want to be sure. Like, Hank had his own coded language. Neil was a habitual line stepper. He was a shock jock. Rectum, that was what he would do. But Hank was very much a part of that QAM culture. They fomented each other.
Billy, I come full circle and I ask you and Roy.
Just like you guys did it. That's what I would have done.
Perfect.